All right, everybody, we're going to have to move to get through this prophecy. So, again, I'm offering my notes. drobbins@endtime.com. Shoot it to me. I'll reply with a copy of my notes. So make sure you get this prophecy. So the order allowing the Jews to rebuild Jerusalem was given by the Persian king Cyrus in 538 BC, and that's when the prophecy begins. Then verse 25 clearly states that the coming of Messiah would mark the end of that 483 years, along with the gap, right? So, let's talk about the gap between the 483 years and the 7 years. Notice that after the 483 years, two things are prophesied to happen. You say, well, Dave, how do you know there's going to be a gap? That's my point here. Well, if you notice that after that 483 years, two things are prophesied to happen. Messiah was to be cut off, and Jerusalem was to be destroyed. Verse 26, of course, Jesus Christ was crucified, right? Cut off. That would pretty much qualify for being cut off, right? Jesus was crucified. So, around that happened around 30 A.D., and then Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D., and yet the final 7 years of the prophecy contained in verse 27 has not even begun yet. So there's obviously a gap between the 483 years and the final 7 years. We know that for sure. So why is there a gap? If there's a gap there, then it lets us know there's a gap between the first 49 years and then 434 years. You've got to understand that there's a gap. I saw many websites where they try to cram it all together and say, no, it's only 490 years. But that's simply not the case. There are two gaps in between three sections here. It's very important you understand that. Why is there a gap? And how big is the gap? Well, the gap is because the Jews as a whole rejected Jesus as their Messiah. Consequently, God turned to the Gentiles. I'm not talking about replacement theology because I've got Jewish friends that are saved today. Okay? I don't believe in replacement theology. But God did, if you read the New Testament, God did turn mainly, the Bible says the Jews are blinded in part right now, a majority of them. So God turned mainly to the Gentiles to take a bride for His name's sake. Now, this is Bible 101, okay? I'm going to cover some things that we may need to talk about later on even. But, this is a Bible study for you. But this began what Scripture calls the times of the Gentiles. The Apostle Paul described it when he was talking in Romans 11:25. He said, "For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel." Not all of Israel is blind. Again, I have Jewish friends that are saved today. They've been born again, like Jesus told Nicodemus. But the Apostle Paul said, blindness in part hath happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. From our present perspective, we know this gap to be around from Jerusalem being destroyed until the final 7 years begins. This second gap in Daniel's 490-year prophecy, it's about 2,000 years. The gap will continue until the signing of this coming Palestinian-Israeli peace agreement. That's why it's so important you understand this prophecy. If you just read down through there, man, you think, wow. But once you tie all the verses into it, you can say, wow, this is so cool. So, the final 7 years of the 490-year prophecy are described in Daniel 9:27. And that verse contains the prophecy of this Middle East peace agreement that will mark the beginning of the final 7 years. So Daniel 9:27 says, "And he, the Antichrist," I'm going to prove that to you in a moment, scripturally, "and he, the Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." It's a 7-year period. In the midst of that week, 3½ years in, he's going to cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, the overspreading of abominations, and he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. So there are several things we must understand from Daniel 9:27. Number one, and I'm going to answer these questions. Who is the he? You say, well, David, it's just easy for you to say it's the Antichrist, but how do you know? I'm going to give you scriptures. Number 2, we need to understand what the covenant is. Number 3, what are the sacrifices that will be stopped? Number 4, what is the abomination of desolation? So I'm going to answer these 4 questions one at a time. Number 1, who is the he in Daniel 9:27? Well, the he here does 3 things. Again, if you just look at Daniel 9:24 through 27, you're going to be stuck. You're going to go, oh man, how in the world? How did you guys figure all that out? You got to tie other prophecies into it that deal with the same prophecy. So, the he here does 3 things. Number 1, he confirms the covenant. Well, the Antichrist confirms the covenant. If you look in Daniel 11, 21 through 45, it describes the actions of the Antichrist. That entire section right there, 21 through 45 of Daniel 11, it's referring to the Antichrist. So when you get to verse 21 and 22, he is called the Prince of the Covenant. That's number 1. Number 2, the Antichrist causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. The he. Well, in Daniel 11:31, the Antichrist causes the sacrifices to stop. That's clue number 2. And then also in Daniel 9:27, this he places the abomination of desolation. When you go to Daniel 11:31, the Bible says the Antichrist places the abomination that makes desolate. So 3 clues. I mean, irrefutable. The Antichrist does all 3 things. So we have absolute proof that the he in Daniel 9:27 is the Antichrist. Okay? Oh man, what was the next question? What's the covenant? Well, back in Genesis 15:18, it describes the covenant that God made with Abraham, and it said, in the same day that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, hey, Abraham, unto thy seed, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that lineage, unto thy seed have I given this promised land, from the river in Egypt all the way up to the great river, the river Euphrates. And at the time of this divine promise, Abraham was in the land of Israel. And the Abrahamic covenant was God's promise to Abraham that the promised land would belong to him and his descendants, not through Ishmael, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and that lineage forever. That's the covenant. What the confirming, or the confirmation of the covenant? Well, when the Middle East peace agreement is signed, the Antichrist and the international community are going to confirm Israel's right to exist in the Holy Land. Remember, they're confirming the covenant, so they're confirming what God promised Abraham. They're going to confirm his lineage and their right to exist in the Holy Land. Presently, Israel's enemies deny that Israel has a right to a homeland in the promised land, the land that God promised Abraham. The Antichrist is going to, and the international community is going to confirm their right to be there. It's the confirmation of the covenant. When the confirmation of the covenant takes place at the time of the signing of this Palestinian-Israeli peace agreement, the final 7 years to the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus Christ will begin. You need to be able to explain this to your friends, family, and sphere of influence. Okay? What sacrifices will the Antichrist stop? Well, the Middle East peace agreement is going to place the Temple Mount under a sharing arrangement between the Jews and Muslims, and Israel. They're going to build a third temple, and Israel's going to be allowed to build their third temple at that time. Well, when they build the temple, animal sacrifices are going to be offered just like they did in the Old Testament. And these are the sacrifices the Antichrist will stop, probably at the urging of the animal rights activist at that point. What is the abomination of desolation? Well, in Matthew 24:15, Jesus said, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. This is the Olivet Discourse. Him and his disciples are up on the Mount of Olives looking down over the Temple Mount. And he says, hey, when those in the end time, towards the end of the age, when they see that event called the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel in Daniel 9:27, and he's standing in the holy place, which is down there on the Temple Mount, he says this, he says, "Whoso readeth, let him understand." A lot of people say Bible prophecy can't be understood, but that's not what Jesus taught us. Jesus knew that the people of the time of the end would be able to understand Daniel's writings and understand these things. So, according to Jesus, the abomination of desolation will occur in the holy place. The holy place is in the temple or down there on the Temple Mount. And the Apostle Paul gave more detail. He described the abomination of desolation in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3 through 4. He said, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day," what day? "The second coming of Jesus Christ and our gathering together in Him, the rapture. That day shall not come, except there comes a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition," the Antichrist. The Apostle Paul taught specifically the coming of the Lord and the rapture would not occur until after the Antichrist was revealed. You say, whoa, hold on. I thought the church was going to be raptured out prior to that. That's a whole different discussion for another day. But that's what the Apostle Paul's teaching here. The Apostle Paul was teaching against the doctrine of imminency. Okay? So, "Whoso opposeth and exalteth himself, the Antichrist, above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." It's the abomination of desolation. The man of sin or the son of perdition, both refer to the end-time world leader called the Antichrist. Paul taught in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the Antichrist will stand in that temple, exalt himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, claiming to be God. When he commits this blasphemous act, that will be the abomination of desolation. So if I were to summarize this peace agreement, because this stuff's going to happen right in the very near future. And I know there have been many agreements made already with Israel, but they were not the one. The Oslo Peace Accords, the Wye River Accords, the Camp David Accords, everything that's been tried up to this point. Nothing has been the agreement that started the final 7 years, but we can recognize it. In Daniel 9:27, again, it prophesies that the Antichrist will confirm Israel's right to exist in the Promised Land. And that agreement will be a 7-year interim or a temporary agreement. It's not just from here on. It's going to be a temporary. The Bible tells us it's going to be 7 years. And it will be temporary because the status of Jerusalem is going to be left unresolved. And then also there's going to be a creation of a Palestinian state. I know that looks impossible right now. But the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, which was prophesied in the Bible, the healing of the deadly wound, that looked impossible, didn't it? It was the symbol of the Cold War. But my father-in-law started teaching back when? Mid to late 60s. That the Berlin Wall would be torn down, the two Germanys would reunite. That would be the catalyst that would launch us into the New World Order. And in 1986, he wrote a book, and in 89, it came down. It looked impossible. Most of his friends said, "Irvin Baxter, don't write that," but he did it anyway because it's in the Bible, and it did come down. The Bible also prophesies a peace agreement in the near future. It looks impossible right now, but the prophecies always come to pass, folks. And these things are going to happen just right around the bend. It's being talked about in our news right now. You know, everyone, a lot of people want to know what we follow with Israel. What news stores are you following? Everything in Israel? I follow everything. I'm following the judicial reforms, the riots, the people protesting against it. I'm following what's going on with Israel and the Europeans that are trying to help the Palestinians expand their reach in the West Bank. What Israel's doing to thwart that, the new government. I'm following everything. But I'm telling you, one of the things I follow every single morning is what's going on with the peace agreement. What's Israel doing in the West Bank and this Arab situation, this regional agreement, and bringing more people onto, especially the Saudi Arabians, on the Abraham Accords, Will that lead to this Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement? Because once this peace agreement is signed, that has all the characteristics of the biblical peace agreement, I can come on the radio and say we started the final 7 years. I can't do that right now because the peace agreement hadn't been signed. But I'm telling you, this is coming. Just like all the other prophecies before it, this is coming. And wow, when I can do that, it'll be Katie bar the door at that point. Hey folks, we got 7 years left. You say, oh, End Time Ministry is going to set a date. I'm not setting a date. I'm showing you what the prophecies say here. Okay? So this peace agreement is going to provide for this Palestinian state in the West Bank, historically and biblically. This is the area referred to as Judea. Today they call it the West Bank. If you listen to Netanyahu, he'll say Judea. Did not say the West Bank. When we go out into what we would refer to as the West Bank, because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River, but our guides call it Judea because they're Jews. And they refer to, that's what they, historically and biblically, that's what it is. It's Judea. Now, this agreement is also going to allow Jews in Judea, they're going to remain there as that Jewish minority under that new Palestinian state. And of course we know that from what Jesus said in Matthew 24, 15 through 18 and verse 21. He said, let me look it up here for you real quick. He said, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation occur, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So, again, I read that to you before where he's talking about this abomination of desolation that's going to occur. But then in 16, he says, let them, when you see this abomination of desolation, when you see that event occur, Jesus is talking, again, you've got to understand he's in the Olivet Discourse. What's he talking about here? He's not talking about the Jews. It's not going to happen during the apostles' era. It's going to happen in our era. The apostles said, what's going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so he's talking to us. And he's specifically talking to the Jews that are out in the West Bank. When you see this abomination of desolation event that Daniel spoke of in Daniel 9:27, whoso readeth, let him understand. He wasn't telling them, the Jews standing there with him today, to read. He's talking to us. And so he's saying, whoso reads this, let him understand. And that's why we are going to warn the Jews that are living out in the West Bank. End Time Ministries. We understand these prophecies. We've got a global platform. We've got a college in Jerusalem. It's the reason for all this. We are going to do the door knocking campaign and warn them people. Jesus told us you're going to have to flee. And I can take them back to Daniel 9 and then go to Matthew 24, tie it all in. And that's what the magazine, when the final 7 years hits, we're going to send a magazine to every home in Israel. It's going to be warning them about what's coming. And then Jesus said, then when you see that abomination of desolation occur, when that Antichrist stands in that rebuilt Jewish temple, let them which be in Judea flee. For them will be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation occur, let them which be in Judea flee into Israel proper, not down into Petra. Petra would be a suicide mission for them because Petra can house, 800 people? I mean, it's like very small. They're going to flee into Israel proper. The Bible says back in Zechariah that Judah will be fighting in Jerusalem at the Battle of Armageddon. They're not going to be hiding down in Petra. I know a lot of people teach that, but we want to make sure we're teaching the truth here. Read Zechariah. Judah will be fighting in Jerusalem, not hiding down in Petra at the Battle of Armageddon. So in this passage, Jesus is painting a picture of this end-time scenario. Jesus is painting a picture about what's going to happen 2,000 years from now. And Jesus is helping us to understand what the scenarios coming in the near future are going to be when this two-state solution is created. And the Jews living out there in the West Bank, they're going to have to flee. Okay? For their lives. And that event's going to launch the final 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. And Jesus painted this scenario 2,000 years ago, And it's exactly what is presently being discussed in the ongoing peace negotiations. The Palestinians contend that the only hope for peace between them and the Israelis is a two-state solution. The international community sees that. And they claim that their state should be established in Judea. I just saw this morning where Abbas is saying, we're going to go to the United Nations and appeal for a Palestinian state. This is exactly what Jesus was talking about here. The United States, the European Union, the United Nations, they all agree that the two-state solution is the only viable solution to the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also embraced the two states as the ultimate answer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, this is what Daniel 9:27 is pointing us towards. If you want to understand Daniel's 70 weeks, this final 7 week is just ahead of us now, and that peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians, that's what starts that final 7 years. Then, of course, the Temple Mount is going to be shared. This is the first, the peace agreement will allow for this. And, you know, outside the control of Jerusalem, the status of the Temple Mount is the most hotly disputed issue in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Muslims claim the Temple Mount as their third holiest site after Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are the big mosque and everything that's presently up on the Temple Mount. However, the Jews regard the Temple Mount as their number one holy site. And their first temple stood there on the Temple Mount from 968 to 586 BC. Second temple occupied the mount from 516 to 70 AD when the Roman general Titus destroyed it. And God promised King Solomon that he would place his name there forever. And consequently, the Jews insist that their third temple has to be built up on the Temple Mount. So, how is this intractable dispute over this 35 acres, how's that going to be resolved under a coming peace agreement? Well, of course, many of you remember back in the Camp David Peace Accords, back in 2000, Bill Clinton suggested that the Muslims and Jews would just share the Temple Mount. And in past years, there's been a law that was introduced in the Israeli Knesset to place the Temple Mount under a sharing arrangement. And Prime Minister Netanyahu used his influence to delay the action under that law, hoping that the dispute would be settled when a peace agreement is achieved. Did you know all that had went on over the past few years? So the Bible prophesies that the Temple Mount will be placed under a sharing arrangement in this coming peace agreement. It's in Revelation 11, 1 and 2. John said, and there was given unto me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood and said, hey, John, rise up, measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein, but the court which is without the temple, leave it out. Measure it not, for it's going to be given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot for 42 months. That's that final 3.5 years that will be the Great Tribulation. So John was instructed to measure the temple and those that worship therein, but don't measure the outer court because it's going to be trodden down to the Gentiles. It's going to be under Gentile control. And this paints a picture of the Temple Mount being shared between Jews and Gentiles. And this scene is in the prophecy described. It describes the Temple Mount during that 42 months of this, the final 42 months of this 7-year agreement. Of course, this is the Revelation 11, 1 and 2. It's another passage that lets us know that the Jewish temple is going to be built. John was told to measure the temple. You can't measure a temple if there's no temple to measure. He was told to do this when there would be 42 months left. And this lets us know the Jewish temple is going to be built and completed during the first 3.5 years of that final 7-year period. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 4 confirms this. It states that the Antichrist will sit in the temple of God at the time of the abomination of desolation, which will occur halfway through the final 7 years. You can't sit in a temple if there's no temple to sit in. And this proves that the Jewish temple will be completed during the first 3.5 years of that final 7-year period. Of course, I talked to you about the animal sacrifices being reinstituted and then stopped. And we know this because in If you move on down to what Daniel 9:27 prophecy, it says that the final 7 years, it states the Antichrist in the middle of that final 7 years will cause the sacrifices to stop, and you can't stop the sacrifices if they're not ongoing. And then, of course, we know that Daniel 11:31 says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they that pollute the sanctuary of strength shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." And then, of course, the Antichrist is going to commit the abomination of desolation. I talked to you guys about the Antichrist standing in a rebuilt Jewish temple, proclaiming to be God. And that starts the final 3.5 years that will be the Great Tribulation. Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, then let them which be in Judea flee, for then would be great tribulation. It's important that you understand the abomination of desolation happens halfway through that final 7 years. That is the event that launches us into the Great Tribulation. I think every website that I went to stated that there would be a final 7 years of Great Tribulation. There's not one verse in the Bible for that. I want to make sure that we clear that up. Because if you're going to understand Daniel's 70 week, you need to understand what happens. Daniel 9:27 says that halfway through, in the midst of that week, 3.5 years in, the Antichrist would stand in a rebuilt Jewish temple, proclaim to be God, and take the sacrifices away. Jesus said, at that event, that's when the Great Tribulation would begin. There's only 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. The Bible talks about it in many places, and it says, for the timing, times, and half a times. Time is 1 year, times is 2 years, half a time is half a year, 3.5 years. 42 months, 3.5 years. 1,260 days, 3.5 years. There's only 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. And that happens during that final 7 years. It's the last 3.5 years of that, leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ in the Battle of Armageddon. During that final 3.5 years, that's when the Antichrist and the false prophet, his religious partner, will be ruling the world government and the world religion, and that's when the mark of the beast is doled out. At the end of that 7 years is when the Battle of Armageddon, the world governing armies will invade Israel, and that's when the Lord comes back to gather His church unto Him to fight on behalf of Israel at the Battle of Armageddon, and that's the final 7 years.